The wedding hall was grand, its high ceilings adorned with glistening chandeliers. Guests, dressed in the finest suits and gowns, buzzed with excitement, exchanging whispers and laughter. There was a palpable air of expectancy, as everyone waited for the bride to make her grand entrance. The scene appeared flawless, a picture-perfect representation of wealth and status, and yet, the eyes of every person in that room were not on the bride at all. Instead, all attention was on the tall, well-dressed figure entering the hall, Thomas Langford, a self-made millionaire whose presence had commanded rooms for years. However, it wasn't his bespoke suit or the expensive watch on his wrist that turned heads. No, it was the woman standing beside him. Her name was Emily, a name that few knew beyond the walls of Langford Enterprises, the multi-million-dollar company Thomas ran. She had worked for him for nearly 5 years, first as a housekeeper, then as his personal assistant. Emily wasn't wealthy or powerful. She was ordinary, a woman who had spent most of her life in quiet humility. Yet, here she was, standing by the side of a man whose wealth could change the trajectory of entire industries, stepping into an event that most people could only dream of attending. It wasn't lost on anyone that Emily didn't belong in a room like this. The guests, gossiping in low tones, eyed her with curiosity, confusion, and a subtle hint of disdain. Some were confused. Was she his new girlfriend? His mistress? Or perhaps, they thought with a smirk, someone hired to be his arm candy for the evening? But Emily wasn't any of these things. She wasn't a woman of status, nor was she a stranger to the millionaire's world. She was, to put it simply, his maid. The woman who cleaned his house, took care of his personal needs, and handled things no one else would dare to. Her presence at the wedding wasn't something anyone had expected, least of all, Thomas's ex-fiancée, Charlotte. The relationship between Charlotte and Thomas had ended years ago, and despite their amicable breakup, there was still a lingering tension between them. Charlotte was a socialite, someone who thrived in the world of wealth and beauty, and it was no secret that she found it hard to see Thomas moving on, especially when he had shown up with someone so unexpected. The maid. Charlotte had never liked Emily. She saw her as someone who knew too much about Thomas, someone who had been there through every hard decision he made, every lonely night when he returned home from his corporate meetings, and every personal moment he shared. It wasn't a direct animosity, but there was no love lost. After all, what woman would feel comfortable seeing a stranger in the house of her ex-fiancé, serving him in such intimate ways? As Thomas and Emily entered the room, Charlotte's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a tight line. She smiled through it, though the look in her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't pleased to see Emily here. The whispers from the guests grew louder, like a storm gathering on the horizon. "Who's the maid with Langford?" one asked. "Does she think she can just stroll in here and steal the spotlight?" another murmured. The words were sharp, but Emily didn't let them pierce her. She had spent years in Thomas's world, learning how to keep her composure no matter how uncomfortable the situation. But inside, her nerves were on edge. She didn't belong here. Still, she stood by Thomas's side with quiet strength, offering only the faintest of smiles as the two walked down the aisle toward the front. It was the kind of event that would be remembered for years, the kind of wedding where every detail was scrutinized. But it was no longer just Charlotte's wedding. The real drama was about to unfold, and it was centered around Emily, the woman no one knew how to classify. The first stirrings of discomfort came when the guests realized that Emily was not, as they had assumed, just Thomas's date for the night. No, she was the one who would be sitting at the same table as the millionaire's closest friends, and Charlotte's guests had already begun to stir in disapproval. Emily could feel their eyes on her, the way they sized her up with judgment and curiosity. But none of that compared to the moment when the bride entered. Charlotte had planned her wedding to the finest detail. She had envisioned herself as the center of attention, the queen of the evening. But the moment she saw Thomas and Emily together, she froze. For years, Charlotte had watched as Thomas's attention drifted away from her, as his work took precedence over their relationship. She had always known that the millionaire's world came with a heavy price, and while she had been more than willing to fit into that world, she had never once felt like she was truly part of it. But Emily, the maid, was different. She didn't belong in this world, and yet, she was a part of it. Charlotte didn't know how to reconcile that. The ceremony proceeded, but an undercurrent of tension ran through it all. No one said anything, but everyone felt it, the uncomfortable reality that Emily was there. And then, the inevitable happened. As the reception started, the drinks were flowing, the music played, and guests slowly relaxed into the festivities. But Emily had barely sat down at her designated table when she felt an icy hand on her shoulder. Charlotte had approached her with a smile so tight, it could snap at any moment. "I didn't expect to see you here," Charlotte said in a tone that was sweet yet laced with something colder. Emily met her gaze and forced a polite smile. "I'm just here to help," she said, trying to keep her composure. Charlotte scoffed. "Help? Or is this your way of making a statement? You do know, don't you, that you don't belong here?" Emily's pulse quickened. She could feel the eyes of everyone on them. But she remained calm. "I'm just a guest like everyone else," she said, not backing down. Charlotte's lips curled into a smirk. "Well, you're certainly making quite the statement, aren't you?" And that was when it happened, the moment that would change everything. Emily, in a calculated but brave move, reached up and placed her hand firmly over Charlotte's. It wasn't an act of aggression, but one of defiance. "I don't need your approval, Charlotte," she said softly, but with undeniable strength. "I'm not here to steal the show. I'm just here to show Thomas that I support him. You should try it sometime." The room went silent. The words hung in the air, charged with a tension no one had expected. Charlotte recoiled, her face flushing with anger. But Emily didn't back down. She had made her point. It wasn't just the guests who were in shock. Thomas, standing nearby, watched the exchange with wide eyes. He had never seen Emily so bold, so unshakable. And for the first time that evening, he felt a rush of pride. This moment, so unplanned, would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What had started as a simple attendance at a wedding had now turned into something far more dramatic. The millionaire, the maid, and the ex-fiancée had all been thrust into the center of an unfolding story, a story that would leave the wedding guests, the community, and even the characters themselves, questioning everything they thought they knew about loyalty, power, and class. As the tension in the room simmered, no one could have predicted how the night would unravel, least of all, the maid who had just shocked everyone in attendance. The story of Thomas Langford and Emily had begun long before this fateful wedding. It had started in a modest apartment complex, far removed from the glamorous heights of the millionaire's world. Thomas had come from humble beginnings, the son of a single mother who had worked tirelessly to give him opportunities she never had. His rise to wealth was no fluke, it was a product of grit, relentless ambition, and a sharp mind for business. He had built his empire, Langford Enterprises, from the ground up, making connections with people who would push him toward success. Yet, despite all the wealth and power he accumulated, Thomas never truly felt at home in the world he had created. His status was a constant reminder of the distance between himself and the people who mattered most, his roots, the life he left behind. Emily, on the other hand, was someone who had never strayed far from her origins. Raised in a small town just outside of the city, she had always known the value of hard work. Her family was middle class, and there was no room for luxuries or indulgences. She had learned early on that in order to make a living, she had to be resourceful, a quick learner, and someone people could count on. Emily's job as a housekeeper for the Langford family had been a practical decision. It provided a steady income and the chance to escape the small-town life she'd grown tired of. She had no idea, however, that working for Thomas Langford would lead her into a world so alien, so overwhelming, that it would change the course of her life. Their paths had crossed purely by chance. Thomas needed help after a bad breakup with Charlotte, his then-fiancée. He had returned to his family home for some peace and quiet, only to find that his parents' health was failing. At the time, he had been overwhelmed with the responsibilities of his company, and he needed someone to help with the house and take care of the daily tasks he simply didn't have the energy for. Emily had been recommended by a mutual acquaintance, and from the moment she stepped into the Langford mansion, things had shifted. At first, it was just work for Emily. She was given a modest wage to clean the house, cook meals, and ensure everything ran smoothly. But what she didn't expect was how much she'd come to appreciate Thomas's company. Unlike most of the people in his world, he didn't look down on her. He wasn't constantly asking for favors or subtly reminding her of the divide between them. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond that neither could ignore. Over time, their conversations deepened beyond small talk. They talked about their shared love for books, the things they missed about their childhoods, and the challenges they faced in their respective worlds. Emily started to see Thomas not as a wealthy businessman, but as a man trying to find meaning in his life, someone who had lost touch with the simple joys that once defined him. But the friendship didn't come without complications. There were moments of tension, where Emily would catch herself asking whether she was just another cog in his life, a servant in a gilded cage. And for Thomas, there were times when he felt guilty for relying on Emily when he had everything he needed to hire someone more qualified, more suited to his lifestyle. The guilt grew as their bond deepened. Yet, Emily always remained professional, never crossing a line, never expecting anything more than the pay and respect she earned for the work she did. Then there was Charlotte. Charlotte had been in Thomas's life long before Emily ever appeared. Their engagement had been a fairy tale, the perfect couple, the one everyone envied. Charlotte was everything Thomas thought he wanted, elegant, sophisticated, and born into a family of wealth and privilege. They had been inseparable until the cracks began to show. Charlotte's ambition had always been to marry well and maintain the status she had been born into. But as Thomas's business expanded and he became more absorbed in his work, Charlotte had grown disillusioned. She wasn't interested in standing beside a man who was constantly chasing bigger deals and more money. She wanted the lifestyle that came with being married to a successful man, but not the sacrifices. Eventually, their relationship dissolved, but it wasn't a clean break. Charlotte had always considered herself the one who had lost out. The one who had been left behind, discarded for someone or something else. When Charlotte first met Emily, she had assumed the maid was just another face in the crowd, someone with no significance in Thomas's life. But as the months went by, something shifted in Charlotte's perception. She began to notice the way Thomas spoke to Emily, with a warmth and respect he hadn't shown her in years. Charlotte was no fool, she saw the subtle exchanges between them, the way Thomas would listen to Emily's ideas, the way they laughed together in a way that seemed so natural. It made Charlotte uncomfortable, and though she didn't admit it to herself at first, she began to resent Emily for it. The jealousy didn't show at first. Charlotte had been too busy planning her next move in the world of high society, making sure her wedding would be the event of the year. But as the day of her wedding approached, the simmering anger and resentment began to boil over. The thought of Thomas showing up with Emily, someone who had come from nothing, someone who didn't belong in her world, filled Charlotte with a sense of dread. She had planned every detail, from the floral arrangements to the guest list, and nothing was going to ruin her moment in the spotlight. Not even Emily. The decision to invite Emily to the wedding had been Thomas's alone. He had received an invitation from Charlotte out of obligation, but he had no intention of attending without someone by his side. As the wedding approached, Emily had been more than just his housekeeper. She had become a confidant, someone who had shared in his struggles and triumphs, someone who had made the long nights more bearable. He didn't want to go alone, and so, he made the decision to invite Emily. The choice, he believed, was simple. Emily had been there for him when no one else was, and he wanted to show her the same support she had shown him. The day of the wedding arrived, and Thomas found himself torn. His loyalty to Emily conflicted with his lingering feelings for Charlotte. He had told himself that he would attend the wedding for closure, to move on from a chapter of his life that had ended years ago. But when he walked into that hall, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him and Emily, he felt the weight of something else entirely, an undeniable truth that had been building for months. He wasn't just a man of wealth and power, he was someone who had been shaped by the people around him, people like Emily, who saw him not as a millionaire, but as a person with flaws and imperfections. When they entered the room together, everything changed. The air in the room thickened, as if the very presence of Emily threatened the carefully constructed narrative that had been created around Thomas's life. The whispers that followed them were a reflection of something deeper, the unspoken tension between class, power, and human connection. Emily didn't belong in this world, but in that moment, she became the center of something much larger than a mere social faux pas. She had done nothing more than exist in a space where she wasn't supposed to. And yet, it was her very presence that held the room's attention, as if the million-dollar question was, why was she here? What was she doing in a place where she had no right to be? Charlotte's reaction was immediate, a quick glance that conveyed both surprise and distaste. Her carefully crafted vision of the evening had been shattered in an instant. She had always known she was the star of the show. But now, all eyes were on Emily, the woman who had never been part of the plan. As the reception continued, the tension that had begun to rise earlier only intensified. The guests' murmurs seemed to swell into a low hum that filled the room. The air felt thick, as though the universe had momentarily frozen to witness the awkward, almost surreal pairing of Thomas Langford and Emily in the same space as Charlotte, his ex-fiancée. It wasn't just about who Thomas had brought as his plus one, it was about the unspoken message his decision sent to everyone in attendance. Here was a man who had the world at his feet, surrounded by the finest in high society, yet he chose to stand by the side of a woman who had no place in their world. No one could quite wrap their minds around it. They couldn't understand why he would take Emily to a place where she was so undeniably out of place. It wasn't just the people in the room who were affected by the event, it was the entire dynamic between Thomas, Emily, and Charlotte that had shifted. Charlotte had long been the star of the narrative when it came to Thomas's life. As his fiancée, she had been the one who commanded attention at every party, at every gala. She was the perfect match for the powerful businessman, the embodiment of wealth and sophistication. But as soon as Emily entered the picture, quiet, unassuming, and utterly genuine, it was clear that the script was about to change. Charlotte wasn't used to being dethroned. She had built her life on the belief that status, appearance, and connections were everything. She was used to being admired and respected for the image she projected. Emily, on the other hand, projected nothing but humility and strength, a stark contrast to Charlotte's polished exterior. As the evening wore on, Emily did her best to blend into the background. She wasn't there to steal the spotlight or to prove a point. She simply wanted to be there for Thomas, as she had always been. But the world around her wasn't so willing to let her blend in. Charlotte, unable to mask her growing frustration, made it her mission to subtly remind everyone of who she was. She didn't speak directly to Emily, but her glances were sharp and calculated. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for her next move. Would she confront Emily openly? Would she try to expose the rift between them for all to see? As the night continued, something unexpected began to happen. A small group of Thomas's business associates, who had come to the wedding out of respect for him, found themselves more intrigued by Emily than they were by the endless discussions about investments and mergers that typically filled their conversations. They couldn't help but wonder who this woman was, the one who seemed so comfortable in a space that wasn't meant for her. How was it that someone like Emily, who had no ties to the world of wealth and power, could stand confidently beside a man like Thomas? It was almost as if she had a quiet strength that none of them had ever seen before. They were used to people in Thomas's circle who wielded their power like a weapon, but Emily wasn't trying to prove anything. She simply existed. And in that simplicity, there was something magnetic. Thomas, too, began to notice the shift in the room. It wasn't just the guests who had grown curious about Emily. He felt something inside himself stir, an undeniable sense of pride, but also something more complex. As much as he had tried to distance himself from his past, Emily had a way of reminding him of who he truly was. She didn't care about his wealth or his status, she saw him as more than just a millionaire. She saw him as the man he had once been, the man who had started from nothing and made something of himself, but who had never lost touch with his humanity. He had tried to fill the empty spaces in his life with things, with business deals, with accolades. But it was Emily who made him remember the simple pleasures, the things he had almost forgotten. It was during the dinner that things truly began to take a turn. The moment was quiet, almost unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but it was a pivotal one. Thomas had been talking to some old friends from his university days, but he couldn't stop glancing toward Emily, who sat alone at the corner of the room. She had been quietly observing the proceedings, occasionally smiling at the jokes of the other guests, but for the most part, she remained in the background. There was no one around her, no one to guide her through the sea of unfamiliar faces. But Emily didn't seem bothered. She simply sipped her wine and looked on, her eyes steady and unfazed by the quiet judgment that loomed around her. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He had been so wrapped up in his own world for so long that he had neglected the one person who had remained a constant in his life. The guilt began to creep in, followed by a wave of admiration. He knew he had made a statement by bringing her here, but he hadn't anticipated how much it would make him reflect on the choices he had made, not just in his relationships but in his life as a whole. But Charlotte wasn't about to let this moment pass without confrontation. As the night drew to a close and the guests began to gather for dancing, she finally approached him. Her steps were deliberate, calculated. She knew the eyes of the room were on her, waiting for her to make a move. She couldn't let Emily steal her moment. Not here. Not now. With a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Charlotte walked over to Thomas and stood before him. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Thomas," she said, her voice low but sharp, "but this isn't the place for your little maid. She doesn't belong here, and neither do you if you think this is what's going to make things right between us." Thomas turned to face her, his expression unreadable. The tension between them had always been palpable, but tonight it felt different. There was a new undercurrent in their exchange, one that had been brewing for years but had never been fully addressed. It was clear that Charlotte was hurt, but it was just as clear that her pride wouldn't let her admit it. She had built her life around the idea that she was Thomas's perfect match, and here she was, standing in front of him, feeling displaced and ignored. Her gaze flickered toward Emily, who had noticed the confrontation and was looking on from the side, her brow furrowed. "You're wrong," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying an edge that surprised even him. "Emily belongs here more than anyone. She's been with me through everything. And you," he stopped himself before he could say more. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken truths. Charlotte's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. For the first time in a long time, she realized that she had lost more than just Thomas. She had lost the very thing that made their relationship real in the first place, the connection, the understanding, the intimacy that Emily had now unknowingly stepped into. The realization hit her hard, and her perfect world began to crumble in front of her. As the night continued, the dynamic between the three of them began to shift even more drastically. Charlotte's once impeccable facade cracked, and for the first time, the guests saw her for what she truly was, a woman who had been clinging to the past, unable to let go of her need for control and admiration. Emily, on the other hand, stood as a quiet force in the background, no longer intimidated by the judgment of others. Thomas, caught between the two women, had begun to see just how much the past had shaped his decisions, but also how much he had left behind in his pursuit of success. The aftermath of that evening would ripple through their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Charlotte's perfect wedding would go down in history not as the event of the year, but as the moment she realized that she had lost everything she had fought so hard to hold on to. Emily, though unassuming, had become the catalyst for a change that was bigger than any one person. And Thomas, for the first time in years, began to question whether the life he had built was truly the one he wanted. What had seemed like a simple decision to bring Emily as his date had unlocked a chain of events that no one could have seen coming, and as the days passed after the wedding, the shockwaves of that night continued to reverberate through everyone's lives. Charlotte, once the epitome of grace and poise in the upper echelons of society, began to unravel in ways no one had seen coming. Her perfect image, the one that had been painstakingly curated over the years, was in tatters. Thomas had always been her ticket to the life she believed she deserved, but his actions at the wedding had shattered that illusion. She had tried to hold on to the belief that her engagement to him was a symbol of success, a validation of everything she had worked for. But as she replayed the events in her mind, it became clear that she had never truly understood Thomas at all. The weeks that followed were filled with tension. Charlotte's once vibrant social calendar now seemed hollow. She attended events, but it was all a performance. She had to put on the mask of the glamorous socialite, the woman who had it all together, while beneath the surface, her world was collapsing. She tried to reach out to Thomas in the days after the wedding, sending him messages, attempting to arrange meetings, but he was distant, his responses curt and non-committal. It wasn't just the wedding that had made him withdraw, it was the realization that Charlotte had never truly known him. Her need for control, her obsession with appearances, had never allowed her to see the person he was beneath the wealth and success. In many ways, Thomas had been living in the shadow of expectations, his own and everyone else's. Charlotte had been a part of that, but Emily had become the catalyst for his awakening. As for Emily, her role in all of this was one she never intended. She had simply shown up that evening to support Thomas, nothing more, nothing less. But her quiet strength had made an impression on everyone in that room, including Thomas himself. In the days after the wedding, Emily found herself torn between the familiarity of her old life and the strange, new world that seemed to be opening up before her. She had always been a private person, someone who kept to herself and did her job without drawing attention. But now, she couldn't ignore the shift in how people viewed her. She had never cared for the glitz and glamour of the world Thomas lived in, yet there she was, somehow caught in the web of it all. People who had once treated her like she was invisible now took notice. It was as if her presence at that wedding had cast a spotlight on her, making her a subject of curiosity. No one could stop. Emily didn't know how to handle it. She didn't know if she wanted to be part of this world. All she had ever wanted was to do her job and live a simple, honest life. But something in Thomas's eyes, something in the way he looked at her, told her that the bond between them had deepened in a way she couldn't ignore. He had always treated her with kindness, with respect, but after the wedding, there was something different, something unspoken between them that neither of them dared to address. Thomas, meanwhile, was grappling with his own emotions. He had always been the man in control, the one who made the decisions, who played the game with precision. But everything had changed since that night. The way he had looked at Emily, the way she had stood by him when everyone else had turned their back, made him question everything he had built. The guilt he had felt at the wedding, the guilt that had followed him home, was still there, gnawing at him. He had chosen Emily, and in doing so, he had made a statement. But what did it mean? What had he been trying to say to Charlotte, to himself, and to the world? He knew one thing for sure, he couldn't go back to the way things had been before. The life he had with Charlotte was built on shallow foundations, and now that those foundations had crumbled, he was left to face the uncomfortable truth, he had been living a lie. As much as Thomas wanted to bury his feelings and return to business as usual, he couldn't ignore the fact that Emily had become a significant part of his life. He found himself thinking about her more and more, her calm demeanor, her unwavering loyalty, and the quiet confidence she exuded without ever saying a word. It wasn't that she was perfect, far from it. But she was real, in a way that no one in his world seemed to be. The people who surrounded him were always vying for something, whether it was power, influence, or money. But Emily didn't care about any of that. She was just herself. And that authenticity, that raw honesty, was something Thomas had been missing for a long time. It was during one of their quiet evenings together, after the workday had ended, that the conversation finally turned to what had happened at the wedding. Thomas had been avoiding it, unsure of how to approach it. But he couldn't keep the questions inside anymore. He had to know what Emily had felt, how she had perceived the whole situation. "Emily," Thomas began, his voice softer than usual, "about the wedding. I know it must have been strange for you." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't strange. I just wanted to be there for you," she said quietly. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "But what did you think, really? When she looked at you like that?" Emily paused, choosing her words carefully. "I didn't think anything. I was just there to support you. I didn't care what she thought, or what anyone else thought. You asked me to be there, and I was. That's all." Her words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He had spent so much time worrying about how things looked, about what other people would think, and here was Emily, calm, collected, unaffected by the drama swirling around them. She didn't need validation from anyone, least of all from Charlotte. It was a humbling realization. And it was in that moment that Thomas understood just how much he had been holding on to the wrong things. His relationships with people had always been based on appearances, on maintaining a certain image. But Emily had shown him that it was real connection, real understanding, that mattered the most. The following days were filled with a mix of emotions. Thomas knew he had to make a decision that would alter the course of his life. He couldn't stay in the limbo between his past and his future. Charlotte had already made it clear that she wasn't going to accept him for who he was now, and perhaps, in the back of his mind, he had known that all along. He had let himself be controlled by expectations, by the image of who he was supposed to be. But now, he was ready to embrace something more authentic. Something real. And so, he made the call. He reached out to Charlotte, finally breaking the silence that had lingered between them. The conversation was brief but direct. There was no anger, no bitterness, just an understanding that their paths were no longer aligned. Charlotte had always believed in perfection, in appearances, and it was clear that she couldn't accept the changes in Thomas, not even for the sake of their past. As the weeks went on, Thomas and Emily's relationship grew stronger. They didn't rush into anything. There were no grand declarations or public displays. Instead, they simply allowed themselves the space to grow, to understand each other without the pressure of the outside world. It was quiet, but it was real. And as for Charlotte, the fallout from the wedding was inevitable. She had tried to move on, to find someone who could give her the life she wanted, but nothing ever felt the same. She had lost more than just a fiancé that night, she had lost the vision of the life she had always imagined. And deep down, she knew that she had been a part of her own downfall, trapped in a world of expectations that never allowed her to be truly happy. In the end, it wasn't the wealth or the status that mattered. It was the connections, the genuine relationships that were built on trust and mutual respect. Thomas had learned that lesson the hard way, but it was a lesson that would change the rest of his life. As he looked toward the future, he knew that whatever came next, he would never settle for anything less than authenticity. And Emily, the woman who had quietly stood by him through it all, would be the one to show him what real happiness could look like. As the months passed, life began to settle into an unspoken rhythm for Thomas and Emily. What had started as a surprising act at the wedding had turned into something more profound, something neither of them could have anticipated. Their relationship, though still in its infancy, felt like it had existed for much longer, as though they were two people who had always been in sync, despite the chaotic world around them. Thomas had slowly, but surely, started to shed the life he had built with Charlotte, the parties, the shallow social interactions, the endless chase for approval. Emily was there for him, not because of his wealth or his status, but because of the man he was when no one was looking. It was this simple yet powerful bond that began to define them both. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like he could breathe without the constant weight of expectation pressing down on him. They had found solace in each other, and despite the oddity of their situation, a millionaire businessman and his maid, they had managed to create a world where neither of them had to pretend. Emily, who had always kept to the background, was no longer just Thomas's maid. She had become his confidant, his sounding board, and, as time went on, the person he turned to in moments of vulnerability. He began to rely on her perspective in ways he had never considered before. She wasn't part of his world of business and wealth, yet she brought a sense of clarity that seemed missing from the people who had always been a part of his life. Emily didn't need anything from him, and that was exactly what Thomas had needed, someone who saw him for who he truly was. At first, Thomas struggled with how to integrate her into his world. There was a part of him that still worried about how others would perceive their relationship. He was a man of influence, and she was someone who had been in the background of his life for so long. Would people understand? Would his friends, his business partners, or his family accept her? And then, there was the lingering issue of his wealth and position. Was she uncomfortable in his world, or had she simply accepted the fact that they were both here now, in this strange, unexpected place? One evening, as they sat on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, looking out over the glittering lights of the city, Thomas couldn't keep the question to himself any longer. "Emily, do you ever feel like, I don't know, that you're out of place here? In my world, I mean?" Emily, who had been sipping her wine quietly, looked at him with a steady gaze. "No," she replied simply. "I don't feel out of place with you. I feel like I've always been where I'm supposed to be, right here with you." Her response, though simple, struck Thomas in a way he hadn't expected. He had been so consumed with trying to reconcile his past and present, with figuring out where Emily fit into his life, that he had never stopped to think about how she felt about the changes. She wasn't trying to be something she wasn't worried about fitting into a world that had never truly been hers. She was here with him, not because of anything else, but because they had a connection that transcended everything else. It was moments like this that made Thomas realize just how much he had been missing. The people he had surrounded himself with before had never given him this kind of peace. They had always been more interested in what he could offer them, in the power and influence they could wield by association. But Emily wasn't like that. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't want anything from him except his time and attention. And in a world where everyone was vying for something, it was a relief to have someone who simply wanted to be present. It didn't take long for others to start noticing the changes in Thomas. His colleagues at work were the first to comment, as they watched him become less rigid, more approachable. They had always respected him, but there had always been a coldness to their interactions, a professional distance that had never been breached. But now, as they saw him interact with Emily, often with a smile, often laughing at something she had said, they began to sense a shift in him. He wasn't the same man they had known, and while some of them were curious, others began to grow wary. Was he softening? Could the powerful, driven businessman they had all admired actually be changing for the better? It was at a company dinner, several months after the wedding, when Thomas first realized just how much the world around him was beginning to see Emily differently. He had invited her to attend, something that had caused quite a stir among his colleagues. A few of them questioned his decision, whispering behind closed doors about the propriety of bringing someone like her, someone who had been part of his life in a professional capacity, to an event where the upper crust of society mingled. But Thomas had decided, after much thought, that he couldn't continue living in a way that was bound by expectations. He wanted to stand by Emily, to make it clear to everyone that she was important to him. As they entered the lavish ballroom, Emily was calm as always, her elegance understated yet undeniable. She had always been self-assured, but tonight, in front of the sea of people who had once looked down on her, there was something different in her posture. She was no longer just the maid in the background, the quiet observer. She was standing next to Thomas as his equal, something she had never been allowed to do before. The reactions were immediate. Some of his colleagues and associates couldn't hide their surprise, while others made it clear with their cold stares that they didn't approve of his choice. But there were others who began to approach her, to ask her questions, to get to know her. As they did, they realized something Thomas had known all along: she wasn't just a maid, she was a woman with substance, with ideas, with a sense of purpose that they hadn't expected. Emily didn't care for the grandiosity of the event or the power that people wielded. She was simply there, with Thomas, in a way that felt real and unpretentious. Throughout the evening, Emily stayed close to Thomas, her quiet presence a steady reassurance. He could see how others were reacting to her, and although some people's disdain was palpable, others were clearly intrigued by her authenticity. She had a natural warmth about her that was magnetic, something that drew people in, whether they liked it or not. By the end of the night, Thomas found himself speaking with more of his colleagues than he ever had before. They had started to see him differently, not as the rich businessman who played the game with ruthless efficiency, but as a man who had found someone who mattered, someone who grounded him in a way he hadn't known he needed. After the dinner, as they were leaving, Thomas looked at Emily with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "I didn't expect things to go like that," he admitted. Emily smiled, her eyes reflecting a depth of understanding. "I'm just happy to be with you, Thomas. That's all that matters." For the first time in a long time, Thomas realized that he didn't need the approval of anyone else. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Emily had shown him that the truest measure of success was not in the wealth or the status or the connections, but in the ability to live a life that was true to oneself. And in that moment, Thomas knew that the journey ahead was one he would take, not because of anything he had or could achieve, but because of the person he had become through his relationship with Emily. She had given him the courage to step away from the expectations that had defined his life for so long and embrace the unknown. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it, not as the millionaire businessman the world had known, but as the man who had found something far more precious: authenticity, love, and the kind of happiness that couldn't be bought. As for Charlotte, she had long since faded from his life, a fleeting memory of a time when he was still living in someone else's world. But Emily was now the person who defined his future, and nothing else mattered. As the year went on, the transformation in both Thomas and Emily became increasingly apparent to everyone who knew them. What had started as an unexpected connection had evolved into something far more profound. For the first time in years, Thomas was genuinely happy, at peace with himself, and with someone who cared for him deeply, without ulterior motives, without expectations. Emily, in turn, had found a sense of belonging that went beyond the life she had known before. Her quiet confidence had blossomed, and she was no longer just the maid or the sidekick to Thomas's larger-than-life persona. She was his partner in every sense, and the people around them began to take notice. The world they inhabited, one of wealth, influence, and power, was a strange, complex one. But what they had, what they were building, was something entirely different. It was a world where they could both be themselves, free from the trappings of their pasts. They had learned to navigate their new dynamic carefully, aware of the challenges and the gossip that followed them everywhere. The initial shock of their relationship had faded, but the ripple effects continued to be felt by those around them. People were curious, suspicious, even judgmental. But there was nothing they could say to break the bond they had forged. For Thomas, the real work began when he realized that the changes he had made weren't just about him or Emily, they were about his entire life. He had spent so long chasing approval, trying to maintain the illusion of perfection, that he had forgotten what it was like to truly live. Emily had shown him the value of authenticity, of finding joy in the simplest of things. She didn't care about appearances or status. She cared about him, and that was something that no amount of wealth or power could ever replace. And so, Thomas began to rethink everything: his business practices, his relationships with friends and colleagues, even his goals in life. He started to pull away from the ruthless world he had once inhabited, choosing to invest in causes that meant something to him, causes that would have a lasting impact on people's lives. He stopped pretending to be the man everyone expected him to be and embraced the possibility of becoming the man he truly wanted to be. Emily's own transformation was just as profound. She had always been a quiet observer, content to stay in the background and do her job. But as her connection with Thomas deepened, she found herself stepping into a new role. She wasn't just his partner, she was becoming a force in her own right. She began speaking up more, offering ideas, making decisions that were respected by those around her. Her perspective, which had always been clear and unclouded by the demands of status or wealth, brought a fresh energy to everything she touched. The people in Thomas's circle began to see her in a new light. She wasn't just the woman who had been by his side through thick and thin, she was a woman who was intelligent, driven, and capable of standing on her own. Despite their growing influence, the couple faced challenges. There were those who would never accept their relationship, people who were too entrenched in their own narrow views to understand what had drawn them together. Charlotte, for one, continued to harbor resentment toward both of them. She had tried to move on, but the bitterness lingered. At first, she attempted to rebuild her life, finding new partners, engaging in new social circles, but it was clear that nothing could fill the void left by her relationship with Thomas. She tried to reach out to him several times, each time with a new pretense, but Thomas had made it clear that he was no longer interested in being part of her world. The most significant challenge, however, came when one of Thomas's business rivals, an individual who had always had his eye on the lucrative contracts Thomas controlled, began to use his past against him. This rival, a man named Richard Calloway, was known for using every dirty trick in the book to gain an advantage, and he soon realized that Thomas's relationship with Emily was a point of weakness. He knew that many of Thomas's colleagues, as well as certain influential figures in their social circle, would never approve of the relationship. Richard used this to his advantage, spreading rumors and trying to undermine Thomas's credibility in business dealings. He even went so far as to try and create a scandal that would ruin both Thomas and Emily. The more Richard tried to attack them, the more their relationship only grew stronger. Emily, despite her initial hesitations about the public eye, took a much more active role in dealing with the situation, refusing to let anyone tear down what they had built. She became a trusted advisor to Thomas, helping him navigate the complex web of business politics and backstabbing that came with his position. It was clear that she wasn't going to let anyone define her, or their relationship, by anything other than the truth. For Thomas, the battle with Richard and his allies was the ultimate test of everything he had learned. The old Thomas might have been willing to fight fire with fire, using his wealth and connections to crush anyone who stood in his way. But the man he had become was different. He refused to engage in the petty games of the powerful elite, choosing instead to take the high road and trust in the strength of his convictions, and Emily's. Together, they weathered the storm, exposing the lies and deceit Richard had tried to spread. The more the public saw of Thomas and Emily, the more their admiration for the couple grew. Thomas's reputation was restored, and Richard's scheme backfired, leaving him discredited and isolated from the business community. In the aftermath of this victory, Thomas realized that he had crossed a threshold. The battle had been about more than just business, it had been a defining moment in his personal growth. No longer was he the man who bowed to societal pressures or who relied on manipulation and deceit to maintain control. He was a man who had faced the hardest challenge of his life, not in the boardroom, but in his own heart. He had fought for love, for authenticity, and for the woman who had opened his eyes to a world beyond the one he had known. And Emily, too, had proven herself in ways she had never imagined. She was no longer the woman in the background, but someone who had earned the respect of those around her, including those who had once looked down on her. She had fought for their love and for the life they had built together. But more importantly, she had fought for herself, proving that no one, no matter their background, could ever be defined by the role others assigned to them. Their relationship had withstood every test, from the pressures of Thomas's past life to the attacks of enemies who sought to tear them apart. It was a testament to the strength they had found in each other, and to the fact that love, when it was real, could withstand anything. The challenges they had faced only made their bond stronger, and with each obstacle they overcame, they were reminded of the power of being true to oneself. Now, as they looked toward the future, the road ahead was wide open. The world was theirs to shape, and they would do so on their own terms, in a way that was true to the people they had become. They had learned that true happiness wasn't about power, status, or wealth, it was about connection, authenticity, and love. And in that, they had found everything they needed. Together, Thomas and Emily stepped into a new chapter of their lives, one where they were no longer defined by the expectations of others, but by the love they shared, the strength they had discovered within themselves, and the belief that, no matter what, they would face the world as equals. They had found the freedom to live a life that was truly theirs, and that was worth more than any fortune could ever provide. The story of their love, and the lessons they had learned, would continue to inspire everyone who witnessed it, proving that sometimes, the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings.